A silent toast, a bitter vintage, and a truth so poisonous it refused to be swallowed. In the hush that follows an old ritual, something darker lingers, a deception poured drop by drop into the heart of London's fog. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was on one of those November evenings when London seems to fold inward upon itself. The gas lamps haloed in dampness and the air hung heavy with the smell of soot and rain-soaked iron. I remember the fire in our Baker Street sitting room crackling low and irregular, as if even it had tired of fighting the chill. Holmes sat in silence, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed, not in sleep, but in that peculiar state of stillness that I'd learned to recognize as the storm's deceptive calm. Outside, the fog pressed against the window panes like a held breath. It was the soft clink of metal that broke the quiet. Holmes had plucked something from the cluttered ashtray at his elbow and now held it between thumb and forefinger. A corroded coin, its surface worn smooth save for the faintest trace of a crowned head. "From the Malden affair," he murmured, not looking at me. "A case with more rust than reward." I was about to ask what memory had stirred it from its slumber when a knock came, swift, precise, and altogether unhousemaidly. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a single envelope on a silver tray. "Delivered by hand, sir? The gentleman did not give his name." Holmes took the letter wordlessly. I leaned forward. The seal was deep crimson, its edges broken, but its imprint still distinct, a coiled serpent encircling a chalice. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Curious. He slit the envelope open and extracted a single folded page. As he read, a flicker of interest lit his eyes. Sharp, electric. "Ah," he said at last. "Now this is something worth leaving the hearth for." Holmes read the note aloud in his usual dry cadence. "He will drink tonight, and he must not reach the bottom of the glass." That was all. No name, no signature, no indication of sender or subject. But the phrasing was chilling, and something in Holmes' expression told me he had already begun constructing meaning from it. "There's menace here," I said, perhaps too quickly. "Yes," he replied softly, "but more than menace. There's timing, urgency, and intent." He folded the paper carefully and placed it in his inner coat pocket. "Devil's Tavern," Holmes said abruptly. "Eh?" I asked. He had moved to the bookshelf and retrieved a small notebook filled with addresses, symbols, and coded marginalia only he could decipher. "A sailor's den near the Blackfriars docks, once owned by a smuggler who drank himself to death behind its third barrel." He looked up. "It's not the sort of place one mentions in polite society, but then, neither are the clients we most enjoy, Watson." I recalled whispers of the place, brawls, bribes, and bodies pulled from the Thames. "We're to meet someone there." "Midnight," Holmes replied, "and I expect we shan't be drinking." Holmes stood by the hearth now, brushing specks of ash from his coat. The violin remained untouched beside his chair. Always a sign, I had learned, that the case before us held more blood than melody. "You'll accompany me?" he asked, though we both knew it was not a question. "I'll fetch my revolver," I said, "just in case." He nodded approvingly. "Quite so. When drink, deceit, and desperation share a table, it's wise to arrive with something more persuasive than reason." He paused by the door, then added with that faint trace of mischief I had come to expect before the storm. "And do bring your medical bag, Watson. I rather think someone will require it, before the toast is over." We arrived at the Devil's Tavern shortly before the hour appointed, Holmes having insisted that we enter through the rear, by way of a narrow passage that smelt of salt pork and spilled rum. It was there, in the dimness of the scullery doorway, that we encountered the figure who had summoned us. She was cloaked in grey, the hood drawn low over her brow, her gloved hands folded as if in prayer or restraint. The scent of brine clung to her garments. She said nothing at first, and I could hear the tavern's laughter bleeding through the timbered walls, all drunken camaraderie and false cheer. Holmes regarded her for a moment, then said softly, "You've come to stop a man from dying, madam. That much is clear." She turned toward the faint light of the lamp above the back door, and I caught the glint of something in her eyes. Fear, yes, but also defiance. "My name," she said, "is Honoria Vale." The voice was steady, cultivated, though it carried a weariness that bespoke long battles with grief and doubt. "My husband was Captain Bartholomew Vale, master of the Admiral's Ghost, lost off the coast of Dover 6 years ago, or so it was claimed." Holmes remained utterly still, the flickering lamplight rendering his features as pale and unreadable as wax. "You do not believe he died?" he asked. "I did," she replied. "For a time. I mourned him properly until I began receiving unsigned letters, clues, sightings, whispers. At first I dismissed them as cruel fabrications, but recently I received a note. It stated that Bartholomew intends to make his presence known tonight." She paused. "He means to attend the reunion of his surviving crew, which will take place here, at midnight." I studied her face. It bore the strain of buried hope resurrected too violently. "If he has returned," she said at last, "then someone will try to silence him before he speaks." Holmes tapped his index finger once against his lip, and the shadows deepened around us. "And who, precisely," said Holmes, "do you suspect of harbouring such intent?" Honoria Vale lowered her gaze, and for a moment I thought she might falter. But when she raised her eyes again, they held a terrible clarity. "Rupert Liddell," she said. The name struck the air like a stone through glass. "He was my husband's first mate, ambitious, brilliant, and unsparing. After Bartholomew's presumed death, Rupert inherited control of the shipping company. He married me within the year." Holmes cocked his head ever so slightly. "A neat consolidation," he murmured. "You believe he engineered the captain's demise?" "I believe he feared him then," she said, "and fears him more now." Her voice grew quieter. "Rupert is not a man who permits threats to rise from the depths." I glanced toward Holmes, expecting skepticism, but found instead the glimmer of that peculiar energy which possessed him when the game began to smell of treachery. "A toast," he said, "is rarely meant to be heard twice. Let us hope this one is." Holmes took a step closer to Mrs. Vale, folding his hands behind his back in that oddly clerical posture he assumed when dissecting human character. "Your gloves," he said gently, "are hand-stitched, but worn thin at the creases, suggesting long use. Yet the stitching on your hem is recent and slightly uneven. You are a woman once of means, now relying on personal resourcefulness." She blinked. "Your speech retains traces of formal elocution, Cheltenham, I should wager, but carries with it a hesitance common to those long unused to conversation of consequence. You've lived in quiet isolation, punctuated by correspondence you dare not share. Your veil was purchased second-hand, likely from a pawnbroker, as its fabric is sun-faded at the folds. A woman of refinement navigating a storm." Her composure held, though I saw her knuckles whiten. "Remarkable," I said. "Elementary," Holmes replied, "and vital, for if one is to impersonate a woman lost to society's notice, one must know how far she has drifted." At this, Honoria's mouth tightened, but she said nothing. "I believe," she said after a long moment, "that tonight's toast has already been prepared, and that it is not meant as welcome." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "What precisely will occur?" "The crew of the Admiral's Ghost gathers every year on the same date, the anniversary of Bartholomew's final voyage. They drink to his memory. This year, someone among them claims to have received word that he will appear in the flesh." "And you suspect," Holmes said, "that this appearance has prompted Mr. Liddell to enhance the ritual?" He is a man who prefers his ghost silent, Mr. Holmes. Her voice dropped. Bartholomew kept a log, private, encoded and damning. If he is alive, he intends to reveal what truly transpired aboard that ship. Rupert will not permit it. Holmes considered her words in silence. Then he turned to me and said, "Watson, I believe we are overdue for a drink, one we shan't swallow, but shall study most carefully before it is raised." I understood then that we would be present when the glass met the lips. As we prepared to re-enter the main tavern through a narrow hall, cloaked in pipe smoke and spilled ale, Holmes spoke in low tones. "Note, Watson, the swiftness with which Rupert Liddell inherited not only command, but wealth. Vale's death, presumed of course, left a void that Mr. Liddell was uniquely positioned to fill. A suspiciously convenient disappearance, followed by an equally convenient marriage, and now a resurrection." "And what of Mrs. Vale?" I asked. "A woman mourning one husband while bound to another." Holmes's eyes glinted. "She is either a pawn or a player." He paused. "We must consider both." The tavern beyond was a cacophony of clinking mugs and half-sung sailors' ballads. "Does this gathering occur annually?" I asked. "Yes," Holmes replied. "But the difference this time is not the man returning, but the man who has too much to lose." He glanced at the bar. "I shall make a wager, Watson. Somewhere in this establishment, a bottle has been opened with far too much ceremony." He tapped his fingers lightly along the worn mahogany banister. "Let us find it before the toast begins." Holmes turned once more to Honoria. "You must not interfere," he said. "Not tonight." She flinched. "But if Bartholomew is truly coming, then he is already in danger," Holmes said, "and your presence will only hasten the hand poised to strike. Trust instead in calculated inaction." She hesitated, then nodded. Holmes handed her a slip of paper. "This is the address of a discreet lodging house. Remain there until I send word. No one must suspect you've spoken with me." She accepted the note with trembling fingers. As she vanished into the alley's shadows, Holmes turned to me. "We shall re-enter through the front." Casually, as if drawn by the music. "Do you intend to confront Liddell tonight?" I asked. "Confront?" Holmes repeated. "No, observe. Observation precedes intervention, Watson. Else one merely adds confusion to the mischief." He adjusted his cuffs. "Besides, I have not yet determined whether the ghost is truly returning or whether we are watching a play performed by multiple hands." "And if someone dies?" I asked. "Then," Holmes replied, "we shall be close enough to name the man who poured the glass and the one who meant it to be fatal." The Admiral's ghost lay tethered to a forgotten quay in the eastern docks, her rigging slack and her hull coated with the dull mildew of years gone, unchallenged by salt or storm. Holmes had gained us permission, by some string pulled with the harbour master, I presumed, to board her before dusk. She was no longer fit for the sea, and perhaps never had been for truth. The gangplank creaked beneath our steps, as though reluctant to bear the weight of inquiry. Holmes paced slowly down her warped deckboards, brushing a gloved finger along the railing and inspecting it absently. "She was aptly named," he remarked. "There is nothing so ghostly as a vessel that once knew command and no longer answers to it." I followed him below deck into the stale confines of the captain's quarters, where time seemed to sit thick in the corners, undisturbed. "Something happened here," I said, not fully knowing what I meant. "Indeed," Holmes replied, "and something remains, perhaps not in sight, but in absence. A secret is often better preserved by dust than by lock." His gaze moved to the far wall, where a heavy iron chest sat in shadow, untouched by even the memory of light. It was a monstrous thing, that chest, riveted, iron-bound, and bolted to the ship's frame. The latch was fused with rust, but the presence it held was unmistakable. "It has not been opened since the night the ship returned without its master," Holmes said, examining the hinges with a small lens. "If I were to conceal a record no one must read, this would serve admirably. so long as the man who hid it never intended to retrieve it himself. Do you believe Vale left something behind? I asked. I believe he left too little behind, Holmes said. No captain returns his ship to port without logs, inventories, or closing statements, unless he wishes his narrative to be written by others. He traced a faint scuff mark across the floorboards leading to the chest. Someone tried to force it once, years ago. Failed. And Liddell, I ventured. Holmes gave a humourless smile. Liddell does not strike me as the sort of man who fails twice. He simply finds quieter doors to open. He stood, brushing dust from his knees. This chest will not speak to us tonight, but I wager someone else might, and with less reluctance. We found him sitting on an overturned crate in the storage hold, a man whose eyes roamed as though chasing something perpetually just out of reach. His hair was a white tangle, and his fingers trembled even in stillness. "Sailor," Holmes said gently, kneeling before him. "You served under Captain Vale." The man blinked, then nodded once. "Devil drank him," he muttered. "Drank him down with the black foam. But the devil don't drink alone. No, no, the devil waits for the toast." Holmes leaned closer. "What toast?" The man gave a gurgled laugh. "You'll hear it. Tonight, perhaps. The devil drinks last." He looked straight through us, then whispered. "And then he drinks again." Holmes remained silent for several seconds, then turned to me. "Hallucination," I offered, "or opiate delusion, or memory preserved in its most honest state." "Madness," Holmes said. He rose. "He has given us more than he knows. A pattern emerges, Watson. The ghost returns not to speak, but to drink. That is not superstition. That is ritual. And rituals are rarely rewritten without motive." Later that night, by lamplight and cigarette ash in our rooms at Baker Street, Holmes began flipping through the registry of maritime inquests. "I had a suspicion," he said, "and it was correct. The coroner who certified Captain Vale's death, Jonathan Beale, vanished from his post scarcely 8 months later. No resignation, no obituary, simply gone." "A second disappearance?" I asked. "A disappearance that protects the first," Holmes corrected. "Beale was not a fool, but he was a debtor. Liddell's company ledger, obtained through certain channels, shows regular, unexplained payments to a JB for several months following the inquest. And then they stop. Precisely. The last payment was made 1 week before Beale's wife reported him missing. A man who silences another must ensure he does not live long enough to require further hush money." I felt a chill, though the fire was hot beside me. "Then there never was a body?" "Perhaps there was," Holmes said, "but not Bartholomew Vale's." He leaned back, eyes half-lidded in thought. "Or perhaps there was no death at all, only a script, and we are now watching the final act, before the curtain falls." We found the logbook locked within a brass-latched drawer in what had once been the first mate's desk. The pages were dry, brittle, and smelled faintly of coal dust and mildew. Holmes flipped through them with the brisk confidence of a man turning past lies to find their fraying edges. "Here," he said, pointing. "Notice the ink." I looked and saw nothing but neat lines of weather entries and navigational notes. "Too neat," Holmes murmured. "Look at the slant. This is not the handwriting of a sailor who spent 3 months at sea." He tapped the margin. "The entries near the storm's reported date are in a different hand altogether, and post-dated. But surely there are witnesses. Crewman's sign, yes, but all initials, no full names. Convenient, if you intend to ghostwrite a truth." I frowned. "You think the log was rewritten?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that it was written by someone who had never touched salt spray in his life, and more importantly, someone who intended the record to outlive the captain it concealed." He closed the book gently. "Watson, the Admiral's ghost did not return in mourning. It returned rehearsed. That same night, with fog tapping at the windows like a too persistent creditor, Holmes laid 3 pages before me, each clipped from separate publications. The first detailed the financial collapse of the East Bay Shipping Consortium. The second reported the death of Bartholomew Vale, heroic captain lost with honour. The third, a society column, announced the wedding of Mrs. Honoria Vale to one Rupert Liddell. They read like a well-planned campaign, Holmes observed. Collapse, death, consolidation, and each spaced just far enough to avoid suspicion. I examined the dates. Liddell gained majority control of the Vale fleet less than 3 weeks after the funeral. Funeral without a body, Holmes corrected. And his marriage? Barely 8 months later. Convenient, but not rushed. He understood timing. There was a cold admiration in Holmes's tone, one I had heard only when a foe demonstrated precision. He built an empire on disappearance, Holmes mused, not by killing a man, but by allowing the world to believe he was dead and ensuring none would question the narrative. I leaned forward. Do you believe he killed him? Holmes gave a thin smile. I believe the toast was prepared long before the wine was poured. It was nearly midnight when I returned to the sitting room, pipe in hand and boots muddy from the docks. Holmes was standing by the window, gazing down at Baker Street as though London itself might offer confession. I bent to refill the tobacco pouch on the table, and in doing so, upset the jar of ash beside it. The fine grey powder spilled across the papers Holmes had been studying, smudging the ink in narrow lines. He did not curse, nor scold, but watched in silence. Then, quite suddenly, he turned away from the window and said, "Watson, do you know the most effective way to disappear?" I blinked. "You mean in London?" "I mean entirely." I shrugged. "Fake one's death, I suppose." "Not quite," he said, brushing the ash into a tidy line. "You die, but only in the eyes of your enemy, and then you prepare your return." He picked up a photograph of Vale, his thumb hovering over the eyes. "He did not die to vanish, Watson. He vanished to strike." And in his tone, I heard the first thrill of the trap being laid. Holmes, clad in warm black with the collar turned up and his cheeks smudged with ash, looked less a violinist and more a ghost, risen from a coal scuttle. And yet, as we slipped unnoticed into the smoky din of Devil's Tavern that evening, he cradled his borrowed instrument with a reverence that might have fooled Paganini's own valet. He had arranged it with the innkeeper earlier that day, under the name Mr. Oliver from Shoreditch, a man of few words but reliable wrists. The tavern's usual fiddler had conveniently sprained his wrist, aided, I suspect, by Holmes's quiet intervention and an ill-placed crate. From the corner behind the barrels, Holmes played a slow, mournful tune that swirled through the low beams like a question no one dared answer. I sat near the hearth, hat low, nursing a brandy I had no intention of finishing. The room swelled with old sailors, thick-voiced and rough-palmed, men of the rope and storm. Holmes's eyes scanned them from beneath his brow, even as his fingers summoned lullabies from strings. And then, during a lull between tunes, he ceased altogether and tilted his head, just slightly, as though tuning himself not to melody, but to a conversation unfolding somewhere just beneath the boards. Afterward, in the alley where we met briefly before midnight, Holmes recounted what he had heard, no, overheard, beneath the tavern's din. "There is a cellar below," he began, "not part of the public floor plan. Liddell met there tonight with one other, a man I did not recognise by voice, but whose vocabulary places him in naval supply or provisioning." "What was said?" I asked. Holmes's expression darkened. "They spoke of a toast, not one of celebration, but of necessity. The man returning tonight, if he is indeed Vale, intends to make a public declaration. Liddell believes it will implicate him. The glass must not be emptied, Watson. It must fall before the words do." "A poisoned toast?" I whispered. "Possibly, more likely, a theatrical one. I suspect our Mr. Liddell intends the spectacle of collapse to erase any confession." "And the man he spoke with?" Loyal enough to kill or coward enough to obey, either serves. I felt the chill rise beneath my collar. Then tonight's gathering will be a stage, Holmes interrupted. And the toast, a dagger. He straightened his cuffs with eerie calm. Let us observe it all from the stalls, Watson. With luck, the villain shall play his part too, convincingly. The hour neared 12. The room dimmed, whether from the coals dying in the hearth or the hush that fell among the gathered sailors, I could not say. There was a strange reverence in the air, as if the Devil's Tavern, so often host to riot, had remembered its own name and now grew sombre before it. Rupert Liddell stood near the back, hands clasped behind him, his waistcoat immaculate, his face unreadable. To those unaware of our purpose, he looked merely like a host awaiting a guest. Then the door opened, and a man entered. He wore a long naval coat, dark with age and salt. His face was masked, half covered by a sailor's scarf pulled high to the cheekbones. But his stance, his build, and above all the palpable silence that fell at his arrival, told every man in the room who he claimed to be. "Bartholomew Vale," someone whispered. The man walked slowly to the centre of the room. No one dared intercept him. He raised his hand. "I drink," he said hoarsely, "to the truth long drowned, and to the memory that does not forget." Holmes tensed beside me. The man reached for a glass of red liquid on the table, and I held my breath. The man's fingers gripped the stem. The room seemed to stop breathing. He lifted the glass to his lips, not hurriedly, but with the dignity of one who knows every eye is upon him and intends them to see. He took a single sip. He swayed slightly. Then, without a word more, he pitched forward, striking the floor with a dull, sickening thud. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered beside him. The liquid spread slowly, first across the floorboards, then into silence. Several men rushed forward. One cried out, "It's the captain! He's dead again!" Holmes grabbed my sleeve. "Do not move. But he may be... He's not our concern yet. The glass, Watson." Holmes darted to the broken stem and lifted a fragment, holding it to his nose. "Almond," he murmured. "Not in the wine, in the rim." He stood. And yet, look at the man's face. No convulsions, no panic. Then what? "A performance," he said darkly. "For whom, we do not yet know." The crowd was in chaos. Liddell's face had paled. I saw his hand slip into his coat, perhaps instinctively seeking a reassurance of a contingency not needed. Holmes said, "That was not Vale." I stared at him. "Not? Too rehearsed, too clean. The real Vale would not fall so neatly. The play continues, Watson. We've only seen the opening act." I knelt beside the fallen figure, searching instinctively for signs of life. But Holmes remained standing, his gaze fixed not on the man, but on the stemless remains of the shattered glass. He crouched with delicate precision, lifting the largest fragment and sniffing it lightly. "Cyanide," I said quietly. "Surely." "Not in the wine," he replied. "The scent is not in the dregs, Watson, but on the lip. Notice the residue, shiny, crystalline, brushed unevenly along the rim. Amateur work, though clever." He turned the fragment in his fingers. Whoever prepared this wished the act to be dramatic. A man falling mid-toast, mid-sentence, preferably mid-revelation. And yet, it was not Vale, I reminded him. "No," Holmes said, standing. "It was a man trained to play Vale's part to perfection. An actor, perhaps. Someone who had studied the captain's gait, voice, stature, but not someone who had ever commanded a ship in a storm." I looked across the crowd, now murmuring in clumps, suspicion rising like smoke. Liddell's jaw was set, his eyes flicking like a man watching the dam crack. Holmes turned to me with a sudden edge in his voice. "Watson, I need a message delivered, and I need it now." Holmes pressed a folded scrap of paper into my hand. "Liddell's office is in Belgravia. Number 27, Holland Lane. There is a cabinet above his desk. On the top shelf sits a large model ship, Spanish galleon, mahogany stand. The middle mast unscrews. Holmes, this is hardly the hour for... There's no time for protest, old friend. What lies inside that model is our captain's true voice. Go, and be swift. I confess that I made poor time, only between Baker Street and the hansom. The rest I left to the horse, whose enthusiasm, I suspect, exceeded even my own. Within half an hour I was forcing open a polished oak door with the aid of Holmes's skeleton key and my own misplaced sense of delicacy. The office was richly appointed, books bound in calfskin, globe maps of the Atlantic, and the galleon exactly where Holmes had described. I climbed the chair with less dignity than I'd have liked, removed the ship, and twisted the mast. It resisted, then gave way with a satisfying click. Inside, curled and ribbon-tied, was a parchment, old, yellowing, and lined with sea-warped ink. It was addressed not to a name, but a phrase. To whom this reaches after the lie is told. The signature at the bottom left no doubt. Bartholomew Vale. I pressed it to my coat and fled the room before hesitation could find me. Holmes had asked for speed, and for once I required no further persuasion. By the time I returned to Devil's Tavern, the false veil had been carried to a back room, and the crowd dispersed with half-hearted grumbles about weak hearts and cheaper rum. Holmes stood by the hearth, his fingers laced behind his back, watching the coals as one might watch a confession smoulder. I handed him the parchment. It was there. He unrolled it carefully, his eyes scanning the jagged script. As he read, his brow grew still, not furrowed, but utterly smooth, as though thought had narrowed itself to a single sharpened line. After a long pause, he folded the letter and slipped it into his inner coat. "The ghost," he said softly, "has spoken at last." "What does it say?" "That the storm which took the Admiral's ghost was no accident, that the ship's rudder was tampered with, that men aboard plotted a mutiny masked as misfortune, and that the ringleader wore a waistcoat lined with silver buttons and ambition. Liddell? He did not kill Vale, Watson. He abandoned him, and he paid others to certify the drowning." He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "But Vale did not die. He lived long enough to write this, long enough to plan." "Plan what?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. Tonight was no accident. It was a message, and the man who drank was not the captain, but a messenger. The true toast has yet to be poured, and this time the glass will not fall. It was 2 nights after the false collapse, and Holmes, with an expression of studied detachment, arranged for a second gathering at Devil's Tavern, this time under the guise of finality. The official word, spread discreetly through the crew, was that the late Captain Bartholomew Vale had left a sealed letter with instructions for his true heir to be named, and that said heir would be announced publicly before witnesses. The bait was set with Holmesian precision. Holmes himself sent anonymous notes to the men who had once served under Vale, promising that those present shall know who among you bears the legacy of Salt and Ledger. Liddell, of course, was included, though no letter reached his hand. Holmes understood well that Liddell needed no invitation to attend an event which could upend everything he had built. "What do you expect him to do?" I asked as Holmes adjusted the knot of his cravat before our departure. "I expect him to prepare the same trick a second time," Holmes replied. "Only this time we shall own the stage, the script, and the lighting." "Surely he won't repeat himself," I said. "He's cautious. He's also desperate, and desperation is rarely original." Holmes's gaze narrowed. "Tonight he will bring a cup laced for a ghost, and find instead that it is the living who drink with teeth bared." I had known Holmes long enough to feel the stillness before his strikes. Tonight, I sensed, he intended to cut the line clean through the keel. The tavern filled slowly, the men subdued this time, not from grief, but unease. There had been no obituary, no inquest, no doctor's report. Only a collapse, a vanished figure, and whispers of something staged. Yet they came again, these same sailors, drawn not by loyalty but curiosity, that most powerful of human tethers. Liddell arrived fashionably late, as was his custom, and posted himself near the casks, as though watching the room for signs of rot. He nodded to several men but did not speak. Holmes stood behind the bar, disguised once more in apron and soot, while I sat near the fire, with a medical bag resting visibly at my feet. Then, precisely at the hour Holmes had arranged, the door opened, and the second Captain Vale entered. He was taller than the last impersonator, broader at the shoulders, but wore the same naval coat and scarf. His posture held authority, and his silence held weight. The tavern hushed as he walked to the table at the room's centre, where an empty goblet awaited. He did not speak immediately, but when he did, his voice carried an uncanny likeness to Vale's, deep, precise, with the flatness of a man long removed from shore. "I have named my heir," he said. "Tonight, I drink to truth, not as a shade, but as a sailor who returned through fire and betrayal." Liddell's hand twitched at his side. The man nodded. "Let the toast be poured. I am ready." Holmes, behind the counter, moved just enough to let the flicker of a concealed mechanism activate, and I watched as Liddell stepped forward, the silver flask already in hand. It was a ritual by now, too smooth, too rehearsed. Liddell produced the flask with exaggerated ease and spoke lightly as he uncorked it. "A bottle reserved for the captain himself," he said. "One of the last he stored aboard the Admiral's Ghost. A suitable vintage for a final truth." He poured the dark red liquid into the goblet and passed it forward, his hand steady, but the corner of his mouth twitched, barely, but enough. Holmes's eyes never left the rim of the glass. As the imposter Vale reached for the cup, Holmes stepped forward. "Just a moment," he said, in his calmest tone. "May I?" The room stilled. Liddell turned. "Mr. Holmes, are you now master of ceremonies?" "I am, for the moment, a concerned observer of toxins," Holmes replied. "Watson!" I stepped forward, removed a folded slip from my coat, and held it to the flame of the lantern. The heat revealed a pale, oily bloom across the ink, one that Holmes had earlier swabbed from the inside of a duplicate flask. "The liquid," Holmes said, "is wine, but the rim, the rim was dusted with something more theatrical. A toxin meant not to kill swiftly, but to seize the throat mid-sentence." Liddell took a step back. Holmes added gently, "A performance piece, in every sense. But tonight, the actor is no longer on your stage." The man dressed as Vale raised the goblet. "A toast," he said, and did not drink. Instead, he held the cup aloft, and the trap, so patiently set, began to close with surgical precision. Holmes tapped the base of the goblet with his knuckle. There was a click, a sharp buzz, and then the unmistakable hiss of concealed wire drawing taut beneath the table. A voice, Liddell's own, crackled to life from a device Holmes had placed below the boards hours earlier. "No, don't say his name," came Liddell's whisper, grainy but unmistakable. "You drank with him, so did I. He was weak, proud, and too clever by half. We gave him the storm he feared. The rudder snapped accidentally, and the crew went silent, each for his price." There was a gasp among the gathered men. Liddell froze, his face a portrait of disbelief, horror, and slow understanding. The recording continued. "I paid Beale off. He's buried somewhere in Sussex, though I never asked where. Honoria was grief-struck and pliable. She became my shield, and I became the captain's ghost. But if he returns, if he speaks, I'll silence him again, no matter who he sends in his name." The voice ended. The silence that followed was thicker than blood. Liddell tried to turn, to leave. Two of the older sailors blocked his path. The man impersonating Vale stepped forward, removed the scarf, and revealed a younger, colder face. Honoria's brother, Holmes would later explain, chosen for his uncanny resemblance and theatre experience. Liddell's strength collapsed inward. "You knew," he whispered to Holmes. "I knew," Holmes replied, "that you feared ghosts more than justice." Scotland Yard arrived minutes later, but the truth had already made its arrest. Holmes returned to his place behind the bar, polished the surface with one swift stroke, and said to me, not unkindly, "You see, Watson, even the devil drinks last when the toast is meant for him." I must confess, dear reader, that as the impersonator of Captain Vale lowered the silver goblet and stepped back, I felt a flicker of unease in my chest. Not because the performance was lacking, on the contrary, it was disturbingly flawless, but because, as one who had met the true Captain Vale years ago, there was something intangibly absent. Holmes, however, had already anticipated the question rising to my lips. "Watson," he murmured, "if you seek salt in his eyes, you'll find only sawdust." At my startled look, Holmes nodded toward the impostor. "The man you see before you is Arthur Greaves, a provincial actor of modest reputation, lately of the Harrow repertory. His last role was Prospero, I believe." I blinked. But the voice, trained to mimic from naval journals read aloud, and one surviving wax cylinder from Vale's old phonograph, Holmes said. "It is an imitation, but one calculated to prey upon guilt." Holmes turned slightly, ensuring that Liddell heard every word. "Our friend Mr. Greaves never set foot on a ship that moved. His seas are theatrical, his compass a prop." Liddell's complexion was beginning to pale. "It was necessary," Holmes continued softly, "to give the dead a voice. And you see, Watson, how swiftly the guilty recognize it, however fraudulent the flesh." There was a sharp intake of breath from Liddell. He had seen the dead return from sea and speak in the tone only he remembered, because he, and he alone, knew what he had done to silence that voice the first time. And now the ghost, with stagecraft and scorn, had risen to drink once more. Holmes produced a sealed envelope from his inner coat pocket and held it up between two fingers, its wax bearing the imprint of a naval compass rose. "A document, written 6 months before Vale's final voyage," he said. "It was left with his solicitor, to be released upon his death but intercepted by one who had every reason to fear its contents." He turned to me. "You recovered this, Watson, from Liddell's private drawer, beneath the model ship with the hollow hull. An ironic hiding place, don't you think?" I nodded, recalling the moment my fingers had closed around the brittle paper inside the miniature brig. "The Admiral's ghost," he called it. Holmes gave a wry smile. "A ghost indeed." He broke the seal and began to read aloud. "If this letter is found, I am likely dead. The sea is treacherous, yes, but not half as treacherous as the men who now sail with me. One in particular, I name Nathaniel Liddell." The tavern stilled as if the room itself had inhaled. I trusted him with my investments, my secrets, even my sister's safety. But I now believe he has orchestrated debts, rumours, and discontent amongst my officers. A storm is coming, unnatural, I think. Should I drown, it will not be Neptune who drags me under, but a friend turned vulture. Holmes folded the letter and let it rest on the table. Liddell had not moved. Honoria Vale, pale but unblinking in the corner, whispered, "He knew." "Yes," Holmes replied, "and now we do too." Liddell's shoulders dropped imperceptibly. The fortress of denial had begun to fracture, and the final blow was yet to fall. It was perhaps the only time I had seen a man collapse under the weight of his own conscience, rather than the blade or the bottle. Liddell made no move to protest, no outcry of injustice. Instead, he reached slowly toward the goblet he had filled, meant for the ghost of a man he had killed, and stared into it as though it contained the years he had stolen. No poison, Holmes said quietly. Not this time. Liddell looked up with hollow eyes. Why? Because guilt, Holmes answered, requires no chemistry. There was a moment, brief, silent, when Liddell looked about the room as if seeking some anchor in the faces of men he had once led, but none met his gaze. The spell had broken. He stood alone now, not as master of ships or secrets, but as a man undone by performance, paper and memory. He raised the goblet a final time. A toast, he said hoarsely, to the sea and those who drown honourably. He did not drink. Instead, he placed the cup back on the table and turned to Holmes. You knew from the start. I knew, Holmes replied, when you toasted a ghost before asking whether he forgave you. Liddell gave a faint, bitter smile and sat down as if his own legs had betrayed him. He would not rise again until the yard took him, though there was no need for cuffs. The man who had walked in had already ceased to exist. Holmes collected the goblet, the letter, and the model ship. Silent trophies of a case closed not by evidence alone, but by shame sculpted carefully into truth. As we stepped outside into the cold evening, I said, You could have let him poison the impostor. Holmes's reply was as crisp as the air. The law punishes crime, Watson, but only guilt punishes betrayal. We walked on, the wind sharp at our backs, and I could not help but feel that some part of the sea had followed us inland, seeking justice in the last place it was expected to be found, at the bottom of a toast never finished. It was not until the last of the guests had drifted into silence that Holmes, with his characteristic serenity, reached once more into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. From it, he extracted the silver goblet, still faintly damp at the rim, and laid it upon the tavern table with a kind of reverence one might reserve for a relic of war. You see, Watson, he said, tilting the cup beneath the lamplight. It was never the wine. That was genuine. An aged claret, French and unadulterated. The true danger lay here. He ran his fingertip lightly around the inner rim of the cup, then produced a small slip of paper rubbed with chemical reagent. The faintest bloom of blue emerged upon contact. Cyanide compound, I whispered. Indeed, but cleverly delivered, Holmes replied. A gelatinous resin applied beneath a false silver lining, designed to dissolve when warmed by the lips and breath of a drinker. Not stirred, not poured, not swallowed. Inhaled. I felt a sudden chill. So any of us, only the one who drank first and deepest, Holmes said. A ceremonial dose, poetic in design, if utterly vile in purpose. He placed the cup back in the pouch, his eyes distant. It is a method as old as Rome, Watson. The murder that masquerades as honour. A toast raised, a death delivered, and the host weeping crocodile tears over the very goblet he chose. And Liddell intended this for whom? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. For Vale, if dead, for Greaves, if risen. And in either case, I realised, the only certainty was that the devil would drink last. Ritual is a dangerous thing, Watson, Holmes remarked as we descended the mist-laced alley from the tavern. It binds memory and guilt with threads stronger than any rope. I followed in silence, still absorbing the elaborate machinery of murder we had only narrowly escaped. The original plan, Holmes continued, was for Liddell to host a commemorative toast in honour of his dear departed friend, a final act of mourning. The drink would be shared by all, but the poisoned cup, dosed and readied, was to be handed specifically to the heir, or the stand-in he expected. With a speech, of course. He was always fond of speeches. But then the plan changed, I said. Holmes nodded. Paranoia, my dear fellow. Guilt's twin brother. The appearance of Vale's voice, the uncanny likeness, the letter. All these things gnawed at the edges of Liddell's control. So instead of a toast to the dead, he sought a more convenient sacrifice. Silence. You mean he tried to kill Greaves? He meant to, but by then the noose was too well woven. The ghost he feared most was not at the table, it was within him. Holmes drew from his coat a copy of Liddell's original speech, typed and creased at the edges. I glimpsed the words, "To Captain Marcus Vale, may his honour be remembered and his sins washed away." But in the end, Holmes said, eyes narrowing, Liddell drank from a cup poured for a man whose ghost he could neither bury nor outrun. And for all his efforts, it was not revenge that unseated him, but the terror of poetic justice. Later that evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes retrieved the bottle that had so nearly crowned our evening with death. He placed it gently upon the mantel, turning it until the faded label caught the gaslight. "A Chambertin, 1861, Watson," he said. "Not something one finds at market, nor in a common cellar." I examined the label and whistled. French vintage, nearly extinct. Precisely, and part of a private reserve once split between two men, Vale and Liddell, when they purchased an estate in Burgundy during a particularly indulgent summer some 10 years past. Holmes tapped the wax seal. The bottles were never sold, never offered at auction. They were stored in a shared vault, yet this one appeared tonight, poured by Liddell with his usual flourish. "So either he had Vale's half," I ventured, or, Holmes interrupted, "he had all of them." I blinked. "You believe Liddell kept Vale's share after his death?" "Not after," Holmes said quietly. "Before." I sat back, the implication dawning. "He took possession before the man was dead." Holmes nodded. "To the thief, the cellar key is always in reach. It would not surprise me to learn that the last bottle Vale ever tasted came from the same collection. And now," I said slowly, "he used it to poison his memory." "Poison, Watson," Holmes murmured, "has a curious palate. It tastes of guilt when swallowed by the wrong lips." I said nothing more, but the room seemed to darken a shade, as if even the wine now mourned the hands that poured it. There remained one final question, one Holmes had not yet spoken aloud, though it had clearly loitered in his thoughts. "The coroner, Watson," he said the following morning, as we breakfasted in rare silence. "You recall I inquired after him in passing." "Dr. Elphinstone, was it not?" I replied. "The one who certified Vale's death at sea?" Holmes gave a curt nod. An odd man to vanish so thoroughly. I sipped my tea. "You believe he was silenced?" "I believe he was bought," Holmes corrected, and the price, as it turns out, was curiously traceable. He laid before me a bundle of banking slips, their notations elegant and cruel. Each bore the imprint of Liddell's estate account, and each was dated shortly after Vale's alleged drowning. "The payments were routed through a false consulting firm," Holmes said, "but the recipient, Elphinstone's own brother-in-law, a bribe by proxy. And in exchange? A hasty report, no inquest, and no questions. But why did Elphinstone vanish?" Holmes looked thoughtful. "Because guilt decays differently in every man. Some, like Liddell, calcify. Others crumble." He folded the slips. "He retired to Italy under a new name. Hasn't published a line since." "And what of the law?" Holmes gave a shrug. "I have sent the evidence to Inspector Lestrade. Whether justice visits Rome or simply forgets it, I leave to higher powers." I looked out the window at the fog rolling in and said, "The sea swallows many things, Holmes." Holmes, still buttering his toast, replied, "Yes, Watson, but memory has gills." It was nearly 2 days after the last echoes of Devil's Tavern faded, when Holmes summoned me to Baker Street with a most curious request, to bring a bouquet of peonies and a bottle of ink. "Holmes," I said, placing the items upon the table, "I assume this isn't some sudden tilt toward the romantic." "Not romantic, Watson, merely surgical," he murmured. "The time has come to stitch up our final thread, and it leads, quite naturally, to Mrs. Honoria Vale." She arrived promptly at 4 o'clock, veiled and unsmiling, Holmes gestured for her to sit without a word. Then he placed a photograph before her, a grainy print of the masked figure who had played Captain Vale at the gathering. The resemblance, though obscured, was unmistakable. "Your brother," Holmes said. She made no effort to deny it. "A theatre man, Brighton stage, spent 3 years in Australia, where he picked up the accent of a sailor and the shoulders of a veteran." "I needed someone," she said simply. "Someone with a spine strong enough to carry Marcus's ghost. Liddell would never have confessed to you, nor to the law, but to a man he thought he drowned." Holmes nodded approvingly. "You baited the trap quite brilliantly." "I baited nothing," she replied. "I merely set the glass on the table. He chose to drink." As she rose to leave, Holmes said, "One might say you staged a tragedy, Mrs. Vale." She turned, her eyes cold behind the veil. "No, Mr. Holmes. Tragedy is when a villain escapes. This was rehearsal for justice." When the door closed behind her, I let out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "She fooled even me," I said. Holmes only smiled. "She was never trying to fool you, Watson." We sat together that evening, Holmes and I, the fire flickering low and our teacups untouched. I found myself returning to the matter like a tongue to an aching tooth. "She lied," I said, "manipulated her brother, endangered innocent men, orchestrated a masquerade that might have ended in murder." "She also forced a confession no court could compel," Holmes replied, his gaze fixed on the flames. "But at what cost, Holmes?" I protested. "Does vengeance wear the robe of justice simply because the outcome feels poetic?" He was silent a moment, then stirred. "You recall, Watson, that I once likened the criminal mind to a spider's web, delicate, intricate, cruel, vividly. Well, now and then, one finds a fly that learns to mimic the spider." I frowned. "You mean Honoria?" She observed Liddell. She understood his pride, his rituals, his taste for theatre and wine, and she spun a better web, one baited not with honey, but with memory. "That's not justice, Holmes. It's stagecraft." "Perhaps," he allowed. "But consider this. How many men die quietly because truth wears no mask compelling enough to be believed?" I looked at him long, then said, "And if Liddell had died from the poison, would we still be admiring the symmetry?" Holmes's expression darkened slightly. "We are fortunate he died of shame, but had he not, it would have made no difference to me." There was a finality in his voice that told me not to press further. He stood, stretched, and muttered, "We live in a world where guilt walks free until art gives it form. Honoria merely gave it shape and a spotlight." I did not reply. For once, I could not decide whether we had solved a crime or participated in a performance too grand for the footlights of law. Weeks passed. The headlines moved on. Honoria Vale retreated into obscurity. Her brother returned to the southern coast, and Liddell's holdings were quietly absorbed into a trust for naval orphans. A gesture Holmes suspected was drafted not by remorse, but by solicitors with a sense of irony. One morning, while I was folding the newspaper, Holmes gestured toward the mantel where the silver goblet now rested. "I have not returned it," he said. "To the authorities, to the sea." I looked at it. Polished, untarnished, and yet I could not bring myself to touch it. It seemed fuller than before. "There is no wine in it," I said. "No," Holmes agreed. "But there is something." I waited. "Truth," he said at last. "Or the memory of it. Then why keep it? Because in some tales, Watson, the drink is not drained because the truth must never be. If the glass is emptied, the story ends. And endings, as you know, are rarely honest." I shook my head. "You sound more like a poet than a detective." "Perhaps," he mused. "But even poets sometimes solve murders." He rose, walked to the mantel, and carefully turned the cup so that the inscription, faint and worn, faced outward once more. It read, "To friendship, to truth, to the sea." 3 toasts, I murmured. "One of them a lie." Holmes glanced at me. Which one, do you think? I gave no answer. I simply watched the way the light danced upon the rim, as if something within still stirred. Outside, the fog clung low to Baker Street, and a distant bell tolled noon. But within, the silence was deeper, carved not of peace, but of a story half told, and a glass that waited, always, for the devil's final drink. We stepped out from the depths of Devil's Tavern and into the chill of a London dusk thick with mist. The kind of fog, I thought, that doesn't simply roll across the cobbles, but clings, like memory to guilt, or tobacco to Holmes's cuffs. Neither of us spoke at first. The lamps burned faintly through the haze, and our footsteps echoed along the pavement as if we were walking within a hollow shell of the city, emptied of noise and judgment. Holmes had thrust his hands into his coat and lowered his head slightly, that peculiar gait of his reappearing, half drifting, half hunting. I followed, uncertain whether to speak. The events of the evening weighed heavily on my thoughts, yet Holmes wore his usual mask, unreadable, untouchable, as though the performance had ended and he had, like all great actors, slipped away before the applause could rise. Storms, Holmes murmured at last, more to the fog than to me. Have curious manners, Watson. They rarely announce themselves, and when they do, they come not from the sea ahead, but from the one long since sailed. I glanced at him, puzzled. It is a naval saying, he added. There is no greater tempest than a man's past, rising from depths he thought soundless. He did not look at me, only watched the street lamps shimmer like stars beneath water. And though I had marched beside him through gunfire and scandals, through asylums and alleyways, I found myself chilled by something far less theatrical. The truth that the most dangerous storms were not the ones we ran into, but the ones we had forgotten ever to outrun. Was it justice, Holmes? I asked, the question tumbling out with more force than I intended. He did not stop walking, but there was the briefest flicker of hesitation in his step, barely perceptible. My dear Watson, he said quietly, justice is like wine. I frowned. In what way? It depends entirely, he said, on what a man can swallow, and whether he can keep it down. I considered the metaphor, and perhaps he sensed my distaste, for he added, justice, when too pure, becomes mercy. When too bitter, it becomes revenge. We sipped something in between tonight, an honest vintage, if not an honourable one. It was the kind of answer that satisfied no law book, and yet, walking beside him, I feared it might be the only kind we ever truly possessed. Holmes gave a small chuckle, sudden and unexpected. I dare say, he murmured, that I prefer tea to poison. I turned, startled by the remark. Though, he added, both have been known to leave a man pale. The distinction lies chiefly in the company one keeps while drinking. You mean the company of murderers? He gave me a sidelong glance. Or widows with exceptional flair for misdirection. We walked on in silence for a few steps. Then I saw his hand, gloved and thin, reach into his coat and pull forth a small paper packet. He tossed it lightly into a waste bin as we passed. What was that? I asked. The last dram of a dangerous evening, he replied, best steeped in silence. I find chamomile far more forgiving, and less likely to provoke confessions. We turned onto Baker Street, the familiar windows hazed with lamp glow and the scent of coal smoke thick in the air. Holmes reached into his coat once more and drew out an envelope, cream-coloured, crisp, and unmistakably marked with the crimson stamp of Scotland Yard. He held it loosely between two fingers, as though it weighed little. And yet I knew, from long experience, that no object altered his posture more than a telegram bearing the word urgent. You're not going to open it? I asked. In due course, he replied. One poison at a time, Watson. I smiled, despite myself. As we ascended the steps to 221B, He paused on the top stair, head turned slightly toward the east, where the fog still loomed like a curtain not yet drawn. "There are some men," he said softly, "whose tragedies write themselves." "And ours?" I ventured. "Ours are dictated," he replied with a wry smile, "by a hand most persistent." The key turned in the lock, the door swung open, and just like that, the devil's tale had ended. But the next shadow had already begun to form. As we turned onto Baker Street, the last of the fog curling at our heels, I glanced sideways at Holmes. He had remained uncharacteristically quiet since we left Devil's Tavern, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the gaslit pavement. Finally he spoke. "Watson," he said, "it is curious how the past, like a well-aged claret, can wait patiently on the shelf until someone uncorks it with trembling hands." "And what of justice?" I asked. "Was it truly served tonight?" Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. "Justice, my dear fellow, is rarely served warm. More often, it is taken like cold tea, bitter but effective." "Do you believe the final trap was set by Holmes? Or was it always her plan from the beginning? Share your theory in the comments. I'd love to hear how you would have solved this mystery. And if you enjoyed the case, don't forget to subscribe for more tales from Baker Street and pass the story along to fellow lovers of deduction and deceit.